The Renaissance of Italia. People who lived in Italy between 1350 and 1550, a period of around 200 years or so, believed that they were witnessing a rebirth of classical antiquity. Of course, the world of the Greeks and Romans that occurred before 500 AD. This is 1,000 years later in 1500 AD, and there was 1,000 years of history and loss of information concerning the Greek and Roman worlds, and the Italian humanist historians at the time were trying to distance themselves not only from the current history of the past 1,000 years, but they also wanted to go back and to essentially study and to emulate the world of the Greeks and the Romans, while also giving witness to the fact that there had been a long time that had elapsed between that world and the world of their own. This marked a new age in which historians later called the Renaissance, which is French for rebirth, and it was viewed as a distinct period of European history, which began in Italy and then it spread to the rest of Europe. Renaissance Italy was largely an urban society. The city-states became the centers of Italian political, economic, and social life. Within this new urban society, a secular spirit emerged, and increasing wealth was created, and new possibilities for the enjoyment of worldly things occurred as a result. Because they're trying to distance themselves from 1,000 years of religiosity and Christendom, and not to say that these people at the time were non-religious. They just wanted to distance themselves from the past 1,000 years and go back to some of the ideals and thoughts that the Greeks and the Romans had held so dear. A new view of human beings emerged as people in the Italian Renaissance began to emphasize individual ability, or what has come to be known as individualism. The Renaissance was an age of recovery from the disasters of the 14th century, including the Black Death, political disorder, and economic recession. In pursuing that recovery, the Italian intellectuals became intensely interested in the glories of their own past, which was the Greco-Roman culture of classical antiquity. The 15th century Florentine architect Leon Battista Alberti expressed the new philosophy succinctly. Quote, "Men can do all things if they will." End quote. This high regard for human worth and for individual potentiality gave rise to a new social idea of well-rounded personality, or what is also termed the universal person. L'uomo universale, who was capable of achievements in many areas of life. The emergence and growth of individualism and secularism as characteristics of this Italian Renaissance are most noticeable in the intellectual and artistic realms. The most important literary movement associated with the Renaissance was that of humanism. And of course, this is not Erasmian humanism coined by Erasmus, but is a different type of humanism, which again is celebrating the l'uomo universale, the universal person, but also the ideals of individualism as well as secularism. Renaissance humanism was an intellectual movement, and it was based on the study of the classics, the literary works of Greece and Rome. The humanists studied the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, moral philosophy, also known as ethics, as well as history, which are all based on the writings of ancient Greek and Roman authors, and we call these subjects the humanities, or in Latin, humanitatis. And we have other writers at this time, like Boecio, who are going back and are trying to find ancient texts and documents and try to translate them so that they can be studied. Petrarch, from 1304 to 1374, has often been called the father of the Italian Renaissance humanism, and he did more than any other individual in the 14th century to foster its development. Petrarch sought to find forgotten Latin manuscripts and set in motion a ransacking of monastic libraries throughout all of Europe. He also began the humanist emphasis on the use of pure classical Latin. Humanists used the works of Cicero, for example, as a model for prose, and those of Virgil for poetry. As Petrarch said, quote, "Christ is my God, Cicero is the prince of the language," end quote. In Florence, the humanist movement took a new direction at the beginning of the 15th century. 14th century humanists such as Petrarch had described the intellectual life as one of solitude. They rejected family and a life of action in the community. Now, however, the humanists who worked as secretaries for the city council of Florence took a new interest in civic life. They came to believe that it was the duty of an intellectual to live an active life for one's state. Humanists also came to believe that their study of the humanitatis should be put to the service of the state. It is no accident that humanists served as secretaries in Italian city-states or at courts of princes or popes. And again, the humanities, the subjects of the humanities was the liberal arts, grammar, rhetoric, poetry, ethics, and philosophy, as well as history. Also evident in the humanism of the first half of the 15th century was a growing interest in classical Greek civilization. One of the first Italian humanists to gain knowledge, or a thorough knowledge rather, of Greek was Leonardo Bruni. Of course, he became an enthusiastic pupil of the Byzantine scholar Manuel Cristallarius, who taught in Florence from 1396 to 1400. Historians have disagreed over the benefits of the Renaissance for women, however. Some maintain that during the Middle Ages, the upper-class women in particular had greater freedom to satisfy their emotional needs, whereas other upper-class women in the Renaissance experienced a contraction of both social and personal options as they became even more subject to male authority. Other historians, however, have argued that although conditions remained bleak for most women, some women, especially those in courtly, religious, and intellectual environments, found ways to develop a new sense of themselves as women. And this may be especially true of women who were educated in the humanist fashion and went on to establish literary careers. For example, Izzata Nogarotla was born to a noble family in Verona. She mastered Latin and wrote numerous letters and treatises that brought her praise from the male Italian intellectuals. Cassandra Fedeli of Venice, who also learned both Latin and Greek from humanist tutors hired by her family, became prominent in Venice for her public recitations of orations. Laura Sarrieta was educated in Latin by her father, a physician from Brescia. And, of course, Laura defended the ability of women to pursue scholarly pursuits. Concerning arts, Renaissance artists sought to imitate nature in their works of art. So we're going back to perspective, the return of perspective in art, in comparison to the medieval art that was done during the early and high Middle Ages. Their search for naturalism became an end in itself to persuade onlookers of the reality of the object or the event that they were portraying. At the same time, the new artistic standards reflected the new attitude of mind in which human beings became the focus of attention, the foci, the center, and measure of all things, as one artist proclaimed. And so we see a return to man as being the center of all things instead of God being the center of all things. The frescoes by Mazzacro, 1401 to 1428 in Florence, for example, have long been regarded as the first masterpieces of early Renaissance art. And with his use of monumental figures, a more realistic relationship between the figures and the landscape developed, and the visual representation of the laws of perspective, as I have mentioned, a new realistic style of painting was born. Onlookers became aware of a world of reality that appeared to be in a continuation of their own, and this new Renaissance style was absorbed and modified by other Florentine painters in the 15th century. Especially pertinent were two major developments. One emphasized the technical side of painting, understanding the laws of perspective and the geometrical organization of outdoor space and light. The second development was the investigation of movement and anatomical structure. The realistic portrayal of the human nude became one of the foremost preoccupations of Italian Renaissance artists. Formerly, though, the artists of the medieval world would have never painted anyone in the nude. So now we see with the Renaissance a rebirth of going back to the appreciation of the human body from an anatomical and physiological perspective. A new style in architecture also emerged at the time, and Filippo Brunelleschi, from 1277 to 1446, inspired by Roman models, created an interior in the church of San Lorenzo in Florence that was very different from that of the great medieval cathedrals. And I've personally seen many of these in person, including the Church of San Lorenzo. San Lorenzo's classical columns, rounded arches, coffered ceiling created an environment that did not overwhelm worshippers physically and psychologically as Gothic cathedrals did, but they comforted them as a space created to fit human, not divine measurements. Like painters and sculptors, Renaissance architects sought to reflect a human-centered world. And by the end of the 15th century, Italian artists had mastered new techniques for scientific observation as well, scientific observation of the world that existed around them, and they were now ready to move into new forms of creative expression. This marked the shift to the High Renaissance, which was dominated by the work of three artistic giants. The first was Leonardo da Vinci, from 1452 to 1519, Raphael from 1483 to 1520, and Michelangelo from 1475 to 1564. Leonardo da Vinci carried on the 15th century experimental tradition by studying every single thing and even dissecting human bodies in order to see how nature worked. But Leonardo stressed the need to advance beyond such realism, and he also initiated the High Renaissance preoccupation with the idealization of nature, an attempt to generalize from realistic portrayal to an ideal form. At 25, Raphael was already regarded as one of Italy's best painters. He was acclaimed for his numerous Madonnas, in which he attempted to achieve an ideal of beauty far surpassing human standards. He is well known for his frescoes as well in the Vatican Palace, which reveal a world of balance, harmony, and order, the underlying principles of the art of classical Greece and Rome. Michelangelo, an accomplished painter, sculptor, and architect, was fiercely driven by a desire to create, and he worked with great passion and energy on a number of remarkable projects. He actually was known as a man who worked with marble, and of course the best marble was from Carrara, and he used that marble to sculpt David, which is a wonderful statue. Also, he wasn't known for painting, but he was one of the greatest painters of all history. Nevertheless, he didn't like painting, but he was really great at it. But he preferred his special craft was sculpting marble. As I've said, these especially evident in his figures on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. These muscular figures reveal an ideal type of human being with perfect proportions. In good Neoplatonic fashion, their beauty is meant to be a reflection of divine beauty. The more beautiful the body, the more godlike the figure. Another manifestation of Michelangelo's search for ideal beauty was his David, a colossal marble statue commissioned by the government of Florence in the year 1501, and it was completed in 1504. And so we see in Michelangelo a blend of the Greco-Roman world and that of the Judeo-Christian world, where we see portrayals of Christian stories, for example, on the Sistine Chapel, mixed with the nudity and the proportion and perspective of the Greco-Roman world. So we see a lot of myths from both stories, those from the biblical corpus, that of the Old and New Testaments, also mingled in with mythologies and stories from Homer and the Iliad and Odyssey, for example. Also, in the second half of the 15th century, attempts were made to reestablish the centralized power of monarchical governments after the political disasters of the 14th century. Some historians have actually called these states the new monarchies, especially those of France, England, and Spain. Concerning the Italian states, however, they provided the earliest examples of state building in the 15th century. During the Middle Ages, Italy had failed to develop a centralized territorial state, and by the 15th century, 5 major powers dominated the Italian peninsula: the Duchy of Milan, the republics of Florence and Venice, the Papal States, and the Kingdom of Naples. Milan, Florence, and Venice proved especially adept at building strong centralized states. Under a series of dukes, Milan became a highly centralized territorial state in which the rulers devised systems of taxation that generated enormous revenues for the government. The maritime Republic of Venice remained an extremely stable political entity governed by a small oligarchy of merchant aristocrats. Its commercial empire brought in vast revenues and gave it the status of an international power. In Florence, Cosimo de' Medici took control of the merchant oligarchy in 1434. Though lavish patronage and careful courting of political allies, he and his family dominated the city at a time when Florence was actually the center of the cultural Renaissance. As strong as these Italian states became, they still could not compete with the powerful monarchical states to the north and the west. Beginning in the year 1494, Italia had become a battlefield for the great power struggle between the French and Spanish monarchies, a conflict that led to Spanish domination of Italy in the 16th century. By the second half of the 15th century, monarchs in Western Europe, particularly France, Spain, and England, had begun the process of modern state building. With varying success, they reined in the power of the church and the nobles, increased their ability to levy taxes, and established effective government bureaucracies. The 100 Years' War left France prostrate, but it had also engendered a certain degree of French national feeling toward a common enemy that the kings could use to reestablish monarchical power. The development of a French territorial state was greatly advanced by King Louis XI, 1461 to 1483, known as the Spider because of his wily and devious ways. Louis XI used a direct tax, usually on land or property, as a permanent tax imposed by royal authority, giving him a sound, regular source of income, which created the foundations of a strong French monarchy. The 100 Years' War had also strongly affected the English as well. The cost of the war in its final years and the losses to the labor force strained the English economy. At the end of the war, however, England faced even greater turmoil when a civil war, known as the War of the Roses, erupted, and aristocratic factions fought over the monarchy until 1485, when Henry Tudor established a new dynasty, and we have the Tudor dynasty of the Tudors. The War of the Roses was, I think, between Lancaster and there was another families, maybe the Habsburgs and Lancasters. I can't remember right now, but as the first Tudor king, Henry the Seventh, 1485 to 1509, he worked to establish a strong monarchical government. Henry the Seventh ended the petty wars of the nobility by abolishing their private armies. He was also very thrifty. By not overburdening the nobility and the middle class with taxes, Henry actually won their favor, and they provided him with a lot of support. Spain as well experienced the growth of a strong national monarchy by the end of the 15th century, and during the Middle Ages, several independent Christian kingdoms had emerged in the course of the long reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula from the Muslims. Two of the strongest were Aragon and Castile. The marriage of Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon they existed from the late 15th to early 16th centuries. And their marriage, again, was a major step towards unifying Spain. The two rulers worked to strengthen royal control of the government. They filled the royal council, which supervised the administration of the government, with middle-class lawyers. Trained in Roman law, these officials operated on the belief that the monarchy embodied the power of the state. Ferdinand and Isabella also reorganized the military forces of Spain, making the new Spanish army the best in Europe by the 16th century, having a Spanish fleet that would eventually be overtaken by the English in terms of the navy, but for the longest time, the Spanish ships were the ones that were the best and the ones that went through to discover the New World. I do want to say firstly that before I end this this talk, that we're seeing at this time the building of strong national monarchies and the development of early modern states. We're seeing that not only in Italy, but also in places like France, England, and Spain. Unlike France, England, and Spain, however, the Holy Roman Empire, the HRE, failed to develop a strong monarchical authority. The failure of the German emperors in the 13th century ended any chance of centralized authority, and Germany became a land of hundreds of virtually independent states at the time. After the year 1438, the position of the Holy Roman Emperor was held by members of the Habsburg dynasty. Having gradually acquired a number of possessions along the Danube River, known collectively as Austria, the House of Habsburg had become one of the wealthiest landholders in the empire, the Holy Roman Empire, and by the middle of the 15th century, it had begun to play a very pertinent role in European affairs. And again, that's the Habsburgs. They were some of the wealthiest landholders in the entire empire. And in Eastern Europe, however, rulers struggled to achieve the centralization of the territorial states. Religious differences troubled the area as Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox Christians, and other groups, including the Mongols, confronted each other. In Poland, the nobles gained the upper hand and established the right to elect their kings, a policy that drastically weakened royal authority in Poland. Since the 13th century, Russia had been under the domination of the Mongols. But gradually, the princes of Moscow rose to prominence by using their close relationship to the Mongol Khans to increase their wealth and to expand their possessions. During the reign of the great Prince Ivan III, 1462 to 1505, a new Rus state was born. A new Russian state was born. Ivan annexed other Russian principalities and took advantage of dissension among the Mongols in order to throw off their yoke by the year 1480. And so we have going through some of our events here. 529 to 533, Justinian codifies Roman law. And again, this is in the Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire. During the 530s, Justinian codified the Roman law and Corpus Juris Civilis. In 535 to 552, we have the reconquest of Italy by Justinian, and in 537, the completion of Holy Wisdom, also known as Hagia Sophia. Now a wonderful representation of both Christian and Muslim artwork in the same building. From 610 to 641, the attacks on the empire in the reign of Heraclius. 636, the Arabs defeat the Byzantines at Yarmouk. In 679, there's a defeat by the Bulgars and losses in the Balkans. And in 717 to 741, Leo III is reigning, and we have the iconoclastic controversy. The Byzantine Empire from 750 to 1453, we do have a revival under Michael III in the 9th century. From the middle 9th century to the middle of the 11th century, we have the Macedonian dynasty. In 1054, there is a schism between the Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. In 1071, there was a Turkish defeat of the Byzantines at Menzikert. From 1081 to 1118, there was a revival under Alexius Comnenus, then Manuel Comnenus, and then At the dawn of the 13th century until the middle half of the 1200s, we have the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Also, the revival of the Byzantine Empire at the time. A Turkish defeat of the Serbs at Kosovo occurs in 1389. Between 1449 and 1453, Constantine the 11th is the last Byzantine emperor, and in that year, 1453, the Byzantine Empire falls. So, that is the brief chronology, and now we're ready to move on to the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. We're now at year 1500.